To come to be grateful for our life, for who we are and the life we have, requires us to resolve our feelings about those parts of our lives that we are embarrassed about, that we might repress, or that we might be defensive about, or that might just bewilder us. Good afternoon. Welcome to my message of the day. I'm Warren, the rector here at St. Columba's. There are, for all of us, parts of our lives that do bewilder us, or that we're embarrassed about, or that we try to forget. But to be truly grateful for who we are, we need to integrate who we have been, so to speak, all those parts of our lives of the past that have led and fed into who we are now. If we can't do that, there will always be parts of us that remain outside of a sense of self. So we will, in that sense, lack a unity of a sense of self. Last week I mentioned one technique, a step along the way to do this. And that's to have a sympathy for ourselves, to try and understand why we did what we did, why we said, why we didn't do what we did, to understand where we came from as children, as young adults, etc., to see how we did actually try to make a response and perhaps discover that that was the response that we made because it seemed the right response or all that we were capable of. And as I mentioned last week, there's great liberation in this because we can come to see that, we don't have to be quite as harsh on ourselves back then because we weren't the people we are now back then. But if we do that, and I have learnt that process and it's been a great benefit to me. But the next step, I think, is to forgive ourselves. Because there are parts of our lives that might be beyond really understanding. Or should I say, we can understand it, what we did and where we came from to get to where we were and what we did. But there's still a remainder. It's like we can't reduce that part of our life down to its component parts of what went before, but there's an element of our freedom or the misuse of our freedom which needs forgiving. And the way into that is to, as I've said so many times, to reacquaint ourselves with God's forgiveness in our lives, to let that forgiveness to soak deep into our bones, to learn how God sees us so that we can begin to see ourselves that way, to learn self-forgiveness. And in doing that, we will resolve a little bit more that parts of our lives that are embarrassing, etc., bewildering. Doesn't mean it's easy. In fact, it's just as hard as forgiving someone who's done something to us. It's an act of grace. It's asymmetrical. I've talked about this before. You just got to do it. You got to have your heart warmed enough to be able to forgive and to be able to forgive yourself. And this reminds me of Bernard of Clairvaux's 4 degrees of love. The 4th degree, and you could Google that if you haven't heard me talk about it before. You could Google Bernard of Clairvaux 4 degrees of love. His 4th degree of love is to learn to love ourselves for God's sake. It's quite a beautiful little statement about the goal of the Christian life, to love ourselves for God's sake. The 3rd degree of love was to love God for God's sake. And the higher love is to love ourselves for God's sake. And part of that is to come to know God's forgiveness of us so that we can forgive ourselves, to genuinely love ourselves so that we can forgive ourselves, to love those, or to forgive, I should say, those parts of our lives that have so troubled us. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.